Okay. Okay, we're going to reconvene the meeting of the Gov't Oversight Committee. Thank you for your patience, in particular Justice Wathen. Thank you for your patience. Anything you want to say about the first issue we dealt with?
No, I think you did a fine job, and I can report that your prior work on Main Turnpike Authority has turned out well since I've been involved, since your work. Actually, that organization is a pleasure to work with on present term.
All right, well,
And
we thank
we
you.
hope we're doing a good job. We think we're doing
Anybody have any complaints about the Turnpike Authority?
Have you lost your toll?
Yeah, we can discuss yours.
Well, again, thank you for being here. We're pleased to hear from you with respect to what has happened since your last report, and in particular, the report of a consultant last 2 months ago now, I guess, and your follow-up report. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Hughes and Representative Kruger and members of this committee. Let me put in, and I'm happy to give you an update on Riverview and the issues that you folks have been concerned with. But let me put it in context by explaining, as you already know, that about a year ago, Elizabeth Jones did a site visit at the hospital to see, are they really on the right track? And she issued a report with 16 recommendations, and the hospital responded to those 16 recommendations in January of this year and said, okay, with regard to each of them, this is what we're going to do. And so I brought her back again in September with the blessing of the court this year to say, okay, this is what you said you were going to do in January. How well have you done it? Have you completed it? Where are you in that process? And so that was the second report, which indicates that there are some areas that are still not taken care of, some they're working on, so on and so forth. Out of the 16 responses, the 16 things they said they were going to do, by my calculation, based on her report, 6 of them have been accomplished, 10 of them are not satisfactorily accomplished at this point, and I'm going to look into that a bit further. As you can tell, perhaps from the exchange between the hospital and me, there's some disagreement about whether they've done some of these things or not, which isn't surprising. And so I'm going to, Monday of next week, I'm going to begin a sort of inquiry, a detailed inquiry into some of those questions, and then I'll hopefully write a report to the court. I'm guessing that maybe by the end of December, maybe mid-January at the latest, and make some recommendations. And then if there's any disagreement about it, we'll go to court and resolve it. So we're going to try to move this along and be fairly detailed about the things that we can do. So let me just give you the overview. Is that there's some positive things at the hospital. One of the positive things is that the hospital is currently operating at nearly 100% capacity, which for the past year has been operating at 80% and having difficulty. And I don't mind that there's only 80% full, but if they're having difficulty at 80%, what's going to happen at 100%? But currently they are operating at about pretty close to 100%. Yesterday they had one bed, which they always try to keep one bed on lower Saco open. And today they have one on each side. So that's virtually full. And it has been that way for about the last month. So they're using capacity, and it may be a low standard, but they're dealing with behavioral problems without the necessity of resorting to law enforcement. So they're dealing with it on their own, and there are no incidents of seclusion or use of measures that any of us would find objectionable. So they're doing, in that regard, if you go back to the days when they were having correctional officers on units and that sort of thing, they made some progress. side of the equation is staffing, which is my understanding is what you folks have sort of focused on, and which will be a part of the inquiry that I'll be making in the next month or so, and we'll be reporting to the court upon. I gave Beth a copy of some of the detailed questions that we're going to be looking at, counsel and I are going to be looking at in the next month or so, and to the extent that she has any suggestions to add to it, we'd be happy to take those into it. I'm not trying to take away your function, but I just want to make sure that if we're doing the work, if we can cover something that you're interested in, we'd be happy to do it. The last time when Jay was scheduled to be here, or the commissioner, they submitted some answers to your questions, and I thought it might be useful for me to just respond, to give you my response to what these answers would be at this time, bearing in mind that I haven't really done the detailed work that I hope to do in the next month. But you asked, essentially, what are the vacancies? And the current vacancies are essentially probably a little bit heavier than this. Probably, I think, roughly 25 or so in nursing, and maybe 22 or 25, and maybe something like 14 or 15 in mental health workers. So that there are vacancies. They still exist. The second question you asked was, what is the current situation with regard to your ability to staff all shifts to the least minimum coverage? And they say, we consistently maintain higher than minimum coverage as outlined by the consent decree. That's correct, but that's accomplished by mandated overtime, mandated shifts. It's also accomplished by not counting, I believe, I'll explore this in the next month. If there's a one-on-one situation where someone has to have a particular person has to have a mental health worker with them 24/7, they count that as part of meeting the ratio, even though that person is not, that mental health worker is not available to the whole unit. So it really reduces to get coverage that you have. And they meet the staffing ratios, I believe, by counting the acuity specialists as the functional equivalent of mental health workers. So between acuity specialists and mental health, and I'll come back to that because that's a troublesome spot. So it's correct that they need it. It's not correct that they staff it in such a way that they can provide all of the treatment that they want, that they can provide the activities that people have. I mean, occasionally, because of staffing shortages, because it may be one-on-one or whatever it is, outdoor activities get shortened for the client, I believe, and so it's not the way it should be done. And we all recognize that this is probably the toughest, among the toughest jobs in the state of Maine, working in Riverview, and we shouldn't be conducting it on a system where we have overtime and mandated shifts and working people. This is a job where you really should put in your 8 hours and go home. And either that or like the state police, you should retire at 20 years. Oh, I shouldn't have thrown that in. But it is a high-stress job. Yeah, what you do. It's
25 years.
Yeah.
But look what it does to them.
Yeah. So they also ask you, what is the status of, you asked, what is the status of the efforts to hire staff? And this you really have to consider it in 2 chunks. Are they making efforts to hire? Yes. Probably the most pressing need long term is that the psychiatric staff meaning the psychiatrists and the PAs and the nurse practitioners. Those people should be permanent, and they're not. There's the clinical director is permanent at this point, and one of the psychiatrists is permanent. Everybody else is on a contract, and they come and go. Some of them are local tenants. There's a variety of things. So the core of the medical staff at the hospital is in and out. And that's not good for anybody. Now, can the hospital be faulted totally for that? No, because psychiatrists are in short supply in New England generally, and probably even in shorter supply in Maine. And Riverview is obviously not the most attractive location to be working. So it's a hard recruit, but in fact, they're having difficulty filling those positions. And I think in the next couple of months, there's a couple of the more permanent psychiatrists that have been there who are going to be leaving, so that the situation is really not improved at this point. I intend to explore that a little bit to see what their recruitment efforts have yielded, if anything. But that's a tough range. The same thing holds true for to some degree, in the nursing category, which is, I was going to say the next most important, it may be the most important, because the hospital really runs with nurses. So you've got this very poor situation where the top medical leadership and the top nursing leadership of the hospital is dependent upon people who are there only for a short time. That complicates their ability to manage the hospital well. It also complicates the treatment. It shortchanges the clients that are there. For example, if you're a forensic client and you're there, you have this pretty laborious process of every 6 months you're entitled to file a petition to get privileges or to be allowed out into the community for one-on-one or whatever. And it's a very slow, for some people, it's a very slow process. And when you go into court to obtain that, the psychiatrist goes along and supports it or doesn't support it. Often, under this arrangement, the psychiatrists really, they haven't been there that long. I mean, unfortunately, that's the case. The person who may have done the most work may not be there anymore, and so you have people filling in. So I'm sure that sort of shortchanges the process with regard to the forensic people. So that hasn't changed. That top level stuff hasn't changed. And as I just told you, there's vacancies on the mental health workers, and there are vacancies in all other categories, in nursing as well. So that's something we have to look at. And I can't tell you any more than that. We will look at it. Yeah.
You might make a question?
No, a question anytime. Yeah.
Thank you. In terms of hiring or shortage, is it the work, in terms of bedside or docs, is it the work or is it the compensation?
You're talking about psychiatrists? Yeah.
Well, the nurses also.
Yeah, the nurses as well. I suspect that it's a combination of everything, particularly the docs. I think one of the reasons that they resort to contract locum tenens kinds of situations is that probably you get paid more than you would get paid if you were a permanent employee there. And it also is attractive to physicians who are retired and want to come for 6 months. Not to say these people aren't good, they're good, but if you're only there for 4 months or 6 months, you're limited utilities to everyone. If there's a guy who's been there 2 or 3 times for 4 to 6 months at a whack, who I've spent a lot of time talking to at various meetings, he's a good guy. He acknowledges the same thing. So I think it is the assignment probably and the compensation. As you know, if you pay enough, you can get anybody to do anything. So but you have to pay it. But I intend to talk with Jay about that. And I spoke with him several months ago. I said, how do you think you're going to be really successful in attracting psychiatrists? And in the budget was a recruitment specialist, which was designed to be, I said, how is that going to be working? Do you think that we can recruit psychiatrists, or are you going to continue to rely upon local judges? And he was more optimistic than I thought he should be at that point in time. I don't know if there is a recruitment specialist, which I identified that, and if there is, I haven't seen any evidence that it's yielded correct results. So that's that's sort of the answer to your third question. The fourth question was, are you monitoring working excessive hours?
Excuse me, do you have if you wouldn't mind, we've got
I-
very inquisitive people.
I don't mind at all.
Senator Burke, thank you.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted that, you've answered one question, Your Honor. The question about the overtime concerns me a little bit. Apparently I understand that might be a bad environment to overuse overtime, if you will. But are you suggesting that ought to be something that we look at, that we eliminate overtime? We certainly made some changes in the prison system about overtime, and I think it was positive changes, but it's pretty hard to function without overtime.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a question of eliminating overtime, but the limiting it. I mean, what the hospital would like to move to the unit-based staffing, which they don't currently have, so that people would be hired to work over Saka, okay? That's where you stay, or Oversight, or whatever. And then acuity-based staffing, which would be a layer on top of that, okay? If because of the people in that unit, your acuity is higher, how do we adjust this staff up? How do we meet that? And to make those two work together, you're always going to have to rely on overtime to some extent if people are willing to do it. I mean, it's preferable if it's voluntary overtime. And you may occasionally have to bring in people from other units in order to meet the acuity. But the degree of overtime currently, just to give you an example, the mental health worker overtime hours in the last year have run about 2,000 hours per month. Mandated overtime for a shift of over 4 hours have run about anywhere from 100 to 50 a month. And mandated means, do you want to work overtime? No, you're going to work overtime. And it may very well be right at the end of the shift that you just completed. And if you look at our end, overtime hours run 600 or 700 hours a month. Mandated shifts run, in October, mandated shifts ran 45 mandated shifts. They typically run about 20 a month for our end. LPNs, a little less, just overtime hours. So no, you're not going to get rid of all overtimes, and I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't suggest that, but we should have a staffing situation that permits them to get by with far less than this. It would be good if we could limit and not have any mandated shifts. That would be a huge accomplishment, and just rely upon voluntary overtime.
Thank you. Senator Guzowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Your Honor, thanks for coming in today. I love seeing you always.
Yes, and I wanted to come and listen today, so I showed up early.
I did the same thing. I even showed up early. But I have a question for clarification for me, because when you're talking about staffing levels, and I'm mostly interested, as you know, in the forensic side. And when you're coming up with your staffing levels, are you taking into consideration, or is it part of your view to look at if a person is fully able to work, or if they might be on some sort of a work-related injury, if they're considered a full employee where there's quite a few things that they really can't do, especially on the nursing staff side of it, who I think are the real ground troops. Because we've been dealing with mandated overtime throughout the state government for quite a few years. State prison was a good example, and the state police. So are you taking that into consideration, their capability of performing their task? We have a lot of people over there working injured. We have a lot of people working over there that can't fully function at their job. And are we counting them as 100%, or are we counting them as 50%, or another one?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm the expert on that, but my understanding would be that if they're there working, they're counted as a full person for purposes of meeting the consent decree ratios. And the important thing, those ratios are minimum ratios. And then, I mean, as Elizabeth points out in her report, the hospital has two obligations. One is to provide treatment. The other one is to provide, safety and have minimum ratios. But you may very well have to exceed the minimums in order to provide the treatment, which is essentially what they're not doing. And so but I think the answer is they get counted, no matter what their position, they're counted as a person. There was one particular shift a few months ago where they were so thin that I think they actually counted the psychiatrist in as meeting the ratio for that particular night. So that's the situation on staffing. You asked the question is anybody monitoring the amount of overtime and so on and so forth? They do monitor it, and there is a sheet that shows you how much it is. And their answer to you was we comply with all federal standards. I'm sure they do, but that's not the way it should be. And that is directly related to, I suppose, currently the vacancies that exist in staffing at the very minimum that contributes to.
Senator Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Justice. I know a little while back, staffing was such a problem that the Department of Corrections was asked to come in and help. Are you familiar with any of that? And,
Yeah.
And I think I also heard that has ended, but I'm curious as to what role they played, how long they were there.
The Department of Corrections was brought, or it wasn't the department, they hired correctional officers from either Department of Corrections or the Kentucky County Sheriff's Office. They were brought in not for staffing purposes. They were brought in because the hospital was experiencing some behavioral problems that they thought they couldn't control. And so they brought them in basically for the purpose of handling those behavioral problems. I went in there toward the end when these correctional officers were there. They didn't do anything except stand there until it was an incident. And they took the person into they grabbed them and put them in there, whatever. That was totally inappropriate. The hospital has since acknowledged that was not the right thing to be doing. It wasn't reported properly, but beyond that, even if it had been reported that it shouldn't be done. So they no longer do they have correctional officers in any of the units, nor do they have Capitol Police are present in the building. They're not on the units unless there is a crime that the hospital or one of the clients claims, and then the police are called to investigate a crime. They may, if there was an active assault going on, the police, if they were called, would come, and if they believed it was an assault, and if they believed that there was some basis for believing that this person had the capacity to commit a crime, they could arrest them and take them away. That hasn't occurred at all in the last year. There haven't been any incidents where they have come in, the police have come in, or the Capitol Police, or local police. And there are no correctional officers, nothing that is even close to correctional officers anywhere in the hospital. So they're operating and controlling the behaviors with mental health workers and acuity specialists. And that's a positive thing.
Whose decision was that to bring the correctional officers in? Did you know about it, or did they consult with you prior?
No, I didn't know about it, and it came at a time when the hospital in 2010 had achieved a level where I didn't think that it really required any, I didn't need to go over there and actively supervise. So the court entered an order saying we were suspending active supervision because there were a lot of other people who would look at the hospital, CMS, licensing, and so on and so forth. And so I wasn't there at the time. I heard about the correctional officers, but I didn't hear about the incidents, the use of pepper spray, the use of tasers. And I certainly didn't hear, and nobody ever discussed with me. I talked with them at that time. No one ever discussed with me how they were handling and reporting those incidents, which was probably the most serious case, because what they did was, at that time, this was the prior superintendent, what they did at that time was they assumed, apparently, that if the correctional officers, for example, if the correctional officers, say, use the taser on a client to put them in their room, that was a correctional incident, and that they only had to report it through the correctional chain of command, not through adult protective services, which would be the hospital's ordinary method. And so what that meant was that the correctional officer would report, I used my taser on such and such, to the sheriff. The sheriff had no interest in it. That's what they were hired for, as far as he was concerned. And so no one knew that was occurring outside of the hospital. And so those should have been reported to adult protective services. They should have been reported to licensing, and so on and so forth. And that's when CMS came and did their survey. They said, you're using tasers and you're not reporting them. You shouldn't be using the tasers unless it's in connection with an arrest, true law enforcement activity, or, and if you do use them, you ought to be reporting it because there could be an investigation. So that is gone. That is gone.
So I was just curious as to how that decision would be made. Is that something the superintendent would just say, do? Is there a process you go through, they had to go through to bring the correctional officers in?
Well, as far as I know, it was the superintendent at the time made the decision to bring the correctional officers in. And then, I don't think there's anything essentially wrong with bringing correctional officers in. It's how you manage their use and report their activities. It has to be a hospital. You can't convert it into a jail. But in fact, I think it was superintendent, whoever, else in the leadership of the hospital at that time would be involved.
Thank you. Senator Johnson.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Your Honor, when we talk about correctional officers, they're really sheriffs. Department of Corrections, refuse, and they're not even allowed to carry tasers in the maximum security prisons full of convicted felons and some murderers. But my question is, before we had the sheriffs come into Riverview, security was really provided by the city of Augusta.
That's correct.
They would get calls.
Not security, but response to calls.
Response to calls was the city of Augusta. And to bring security to that situation. Then we had the sheriffs there. Who is now there performing those tasks? Are we back to calling the city of Augusta when we have a problem and putting the burden on the taxpayers of Augusta? Or are we calling the sheriffs? Or what are we doing?
What are we doing? Well, the use of the word security, there's always been security at the hospital, not law enforcement security, but, security officers who are there, and they're the ones you see as you go in through the door and so on. So they've always been. But the currently Capitol Police are there. As you go by the desk, there's a little office right there. Capitol Police are in there. And they are called whenever there is a need for law enforcement activity. They're not called to handle behavioral problems with a client unless there's a crime being occurred. You call the police. The point of it is you call the police only when you want someone arrested and there's a crime being occurred. It's complicated in the hospital because you always have the question of, yes, this may be criminal activity, but this person is rapidly psychotic, so it's not going to go anywhere. So do you call or don't you call? So it is the Capitol Police.
Okay, so I might just follow up on that then. If there's an incident, somebody's at a call for whatever reason, we're going to call the people on the desk, Capitol Security, to come upstairs and try and work that through. Are they trained differently than the security people we have here at the Capitol, or the security people of the Capitol Police that we have roaming parking lots? We have different levels of Capitol Security, so I'm just wondering about their ability.
Training. They are part of the Capitol Team. The sergeant who is there in charge of it, I met and talked with, he's a retired municipal police officer. I'm sure retired. He was in municipal policing before he came to the Capitol Police. And I believe that I don't know about the rest of it, but I would believe that they're all fully trained officers.
Is it all fully sworn officers?
Yeah. They're regular, and they are pretty clear about it. They come only for law enforcement activities. We say, we're having trouble with getting Dan to go back into his room. They don't come for that.
That's staff.
That's that.
That can be staff, that
And
should
should
be
be.
working under injuries anyway, so it's going to be extra stressful. Thank you very much.
Justice, I had a question I couldn't, I'm sorry to keep you off track here, but talking about the shortage of personnel, whether it's psychiatrists or nurses or mental health workers. Again, I understand that they may need minimum standards and consent decree, but given what's actually going on in the ward, in the unit, if somebody's one-on-one, then obviously that's throws everything else off. So a couple of questions. One is, you presented that as a real problem, and it seems like it's a real problem. Do you sense that the administration of the hospital recognizes that as a real problem? My second question is, all these vacancies, you obviously need to bring staffing up to higher levels. Do you get a sense of urgency from the administration of the hospital to try to fix that problem? Or not? And And maybe you don't know yet.
My belief is that they are trying to recruit staff as best they can, as quickly as they can. So I don't think there's any holdback on that. So that's why, you know, I'm not sure what the court could do about it, but assuming, it would be conceivable that you could say, look, unless you have maintained, the court could issue an order saying that unless your staff is up to this level, your population is reduced to this. And that's what they sometimes do. I'm not recommending that now, but that's what we really need to look at in terms of, can you recruit these people? If you can't, what are we going to do about it? We just can't continue on with mandated overtime and working everybody to the bone and leaving. So we may have to be some adjustments made. That's what the court process is designed to do. We'll take a look at it. Something about your first part of your question.
The acuity level of the patient requiring
Oh, yeah.
additional staff.
Yes, that happens. Like in the one-on-one is the perfect example. If there's 4 or 5 mental health workers assigned to a unit, and somebody is one-on-one, then in fact it's really only 4, if not 5, because that one is. Yeah. So then the real question is, how often does that interfere with activities? One of the prized activities on the part of clients at Riverview is getting outside on a daily basis for half an hour away. At least listening to the clients, and you always have to be careful here because you've got all sorts of different experiences. Listening to the clients, often what happens, if there's a staff shortage because of one-on-ones or whatever, the staff won't have quite enough time to go out for the full half hour or whatever. So it gets shortchanged. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I'm going to look at it in the next month. And that really shouldn't happen. I mean, staffing, you can't just say, okay, whenever we're in a tight spot on staffing, we're going to limit the activities of the clients and limit the treatment of the clients. And that shouldn't be happening. But it's alleged that it does happen. I have a tendency to believe it probably does. If some of the outdoor activities outdoor time gets shortchanged because of the staff being shortchanged.
Just to follow that briefly, so I know you're going to be going back in because you're going to be able to make an assessment in your own mind about the vigor of the hospital's improvement efforts to try to fix this personnel shortage and be able to report back to us.
And I might say it isn't just me, the plaintiff's counsel are going, and the Attorney General who represents the plaintiff are going to be involved in this. The plaintiff's counsel this is not just my quest. They're involved in this as well, and the questions that I've come up with, they participated in, and they'll participate in it fully. One of the most frequent complaints they have is limitation of outdoor activities because of staff shortage. So that they are focused on that as being a problem that they want to address. The final question that I think you asked previously and they responded to in part raised what I consider to be at least a difficult situation currently. You say, your question was, what is senior management doing to address the staff's tensions that appear to be associated with the implementation of the acuity specialist positions? And they responded, difficulty of change, reorganization. It just takes a while for people to settle in. I'm not giving them full benefit of their explanation, but that was basically what they said. This is a problem, and is frankly one of the ones that why I wanted to do sort of a formal inquiry. Because the acuity specialist positions were proposed, my understanding was, they were to be a supplement to the existing staff of mental health workers. So we were having the behavioral problems that were beyond the capacity of mental health workers to deal with it. We had tried correctional officers, but that didn't work. That had some bad results. So the answer to this was we were going to bring in acuity specialists who would address those problems and supplement mental health workers. In fact, what it appears is that rather than being a supplement, they've been an addition, they've been a substitution. Some of the mental health workers are no longer there. The acuity specialists have fill in, and going back to the staffing ratios, they treat these for purposes of the staffing ratios as complying with the mental health worker staffing ratios. So that they're being used the same in some instances. And I believe, and I'll explore this, I believe that at times they are assigned to an entire shift where they work with essentially the mental health workers. Which is not to say that it's bad, but the problem is that the acuity specialists, I believe, have a pay differential of about $5 an hour or something like that. And when you use those people interchangeably with mental health workers, that's not a very good situation. I mean, and it creates problems, which I don't even have to explain to you. I know you understand what those problems would be. If you and I are doing the same job, and I'm getting paid $5 more, hopefully it would be me. You might resent that, and then you'd say, and to some extent, he doesn't even have the qualifications. I have a CNA, I have some nursing skills. He doesn't have those, in some instances. So I'm not sure what the whole detail is, but I believe that this really needs to be fleshed out, because as it was presented, this was to be a supplement to, not a substitution for mental health workers. And at the present time, to me, is rather confused what they're doing. And that confusion has to be dealt with. And I'm sure that Jay Harper can straighten me out on what his plan was. But I've never heard what the plan is for how we put those two positions together, and where are we going with them hereafter. I heard the other day in the client forum for the first time that an explanation of that what they were attempting to do was to increase the educational level of mental health workers, which currently require, I believe, only a high school education plus a CNA certification, certified nursing system certification. And they wanted to elevate that to an associate's degree, perhaps to a bachelor's degree sometime. And they would drop the CNA and they would teach those nursing courses at the hospital. Well, that's a good theory, but I don't know whether that's actually taking place over there. And that's what I want to understand. And it isn't the theory that I understood it. I thought the acuity specialists would certainly alleviate the staffing problems, not come in and say, okay, we're meeting the same ratios. I thought they would say, okay, we're meeting the ratios. Plus, we have an acuity specialist here, because we have a guy down such and such who requires 24/7 activity, and we got to have somebody to spend the time. So that, to me, that's a really difficult situation. And the plaintiffs' counsel share that concern as well, because it's contributing to a lot of unnecessary confusion at the hospital as to where they're going with that. So I'd like to be more specific, but maybe in a month or so I will be.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so for me, trying to get all of this straight in my head, what you described in the report, what we're discussing here, there seems to be a systemic problem in which multiple factors are contributing to furtherance of people not wanting to come to work there, people who are working there not having time to get training, who have working there not having time to give patients outdoor time, and no one being up to speed to the extent they should to be able to communicate the objectives and the treatment of the MOAB, people not having been involved and thought into what's going on to change the culture there, and probably don't have the time to attend the meetings that are available for discussions of those sorts of things. And it's all, working together to promulgate a dysfunctional situation. And what I'm really curious about is whether you'll be able to ascertain from staff how they intend to change that, not piecemeal, one thing here, one thing there, but a whole, creating that vision and buy-in among the staff as to where they're headed, how they're going to get there, and what their part is in defining that work environment and circumstance that meets the needs of clients and a reasonable work environment that they can attract other people to come join them in creating, implementing that vision. It seems to me that you need that overall strategy to address this, not just working on little pieces here and there. If you're going to tackle how people feel about the work environment, how they feel about coming to work there, to change that. Are you going to be able to get into some of that with?
Yes, we are. And what I'm doing is I'm not holding them to what I think they should be doing or what somebody else thinks they should be doing. I'm trying to hold them to what they said in January of this year they would do. So the simplest example is in January of this year, they said they would implement unit-based staffing, which would go a long way towards resolving many of the problems. By 2015, the end of 2015. Well, okay, it's November. It's December now. Where are we on that? And I know that unit-based staffing is not over there. I know that. I'm sure they're working on it. I don't know where it is or where we're going to go, but that's what I want to know. So I mean, I'm not in a position to manage the hospital. I don't know who you are, but I can hold them to what they said they were going to do and what the court approved as being an appropriate response to that situation. They mapped out something that the court listened to. They came and presented it to the judge, and he said, "Yes, this is a good system. This will work if you do it." So the question is, are you doing it? And that's where we're really at now. Is, are you doing it? And if you're not, why not? And when will you do it? And the consent decree really only has teeth in this respect. That after an appropriate inquiry, I could make a recommendation. For example, I could say, you will institute unit-based staffing by January 30th, or February 15th, or March, whatever date I choose. Period. And if they don't accept that, then they can challenge it in court within 30 days. But they have to either do it or challenge it in court. So it's a 30-day trip into court, and I'm hoping that we'll probably reduce the 30 days. If they want to challenge it, they'll challenge it quicker. They have a 30-day maximum. So that's really what it amounts to. And the court could, for example, uphold my recommendation and say, yes, you have to do it. And then if they didn't do it, then you'd be in a position of, coercive measures, which I don't even want to think about. But I mean, that's really what it has to be. We can't present a plan in January and then we have a report report that says, well, you haven't really done it. You've scratched the surface, but you haven't scratched very deep. And then they respond and say, well, we've really done quite a lot. Okay, you know, where are we? We're just going back and forth. So there has to be some accountability built into this. You said you were going to do it. Have you? If you haven't, what happens? So,
Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand what you're saying about what your role, can and should be. I would hope that if we end up at the end of that time frame not meeting objectives for all the various reasons, I think unrealistic expectations because of the factors that are interfering with success of their intentions. I would hope that we question what they're doing about all of those inhibiting factors in their next plan, the next steps, because clearly ignoring them is not working. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to express, I guess I just want to remind people that I told this earlier. This is really unfortunate that there's kind of an empty chair there, and that's Jay Harper. And we wanted to have the opportunity to speak with them so we could have this dialogue about what is going on there, and if things aren't being met, what the obstacles are being met. As I understand, he wasn't permitted to be here, so we can't have that discussion. It's frustrating. Representative?
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. That was going to be my question, is it would have been really helpful because to have Commissioner Mayhew here, Jay Harper here, Judge Wathen here, because we have such a disconnect between Commissioner Mayhew's response to our questions and the investigator's report. And I've been getting the impression from Judge Wathen that he feels the same way, that there's some answers that aren't quite answers. So it would, can you explain further why, what was the reason? I didn't see anything about why those people aren't here today.
There's a protocol in place for requesting agency participation in legislative committee meetings, which goes through the governor's office with the governor's approval. We formally requested under that protocol for Mr. Harper to be here and to respond to the questions that had been provided in writing and talk about them further. The response we got was that it would not be appropriate for Mr. Harper to be giving further response to Commissioner Mayhew's responses, that it was her that would be more appropriate to be here. So we sent a request for her to be here. Her schedule would not allow it today. That's the response that I
Yes,
Did she give a date when she might be able to attend? Because I just don't understand how we're going to do our work and how anybody can do their work if we don't have the people who can give us the answers in front of us. Because I find this type of question and answer very unsatisfactory and non-productive.
Sure. No, and I haven't followed up yet. The response came from the governor's office where we sent the request, so we didn't expound on what her schedule might allow.
Senator, oh, it's not, Representative McClellan, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, sir. Or I guess good morning still. Just two quick things, and you probably already answered my question, but I actually moved to Maine in '86 and worked in the community mental health field, and there was a consent decree going on. So it's just, I sit here thinking, my gosh, 30 years Maine's been operating under consent decrees in mental health. And so that, I just let that float out there. But I read the documents that we were given. There's 3 of them, I assume you know they are, and they were just so, the answers were so different. And I was pretty, I don't know, I'm not going to say I was upset, but I really was struck by the information I got. So I came here kind of wanting to gauge your reaction to this, and I think you're being very appropriate and professional, and you're going to, I hear you saying you're going to go look into this, but I don't know if you want to me, the answers are so different. It wasn't like, well, a lot of the answers were, this didn't happen, well, yeah, it did happen.
Well, I think if you boil down what I've said compared to theirs, I would say, yes, there are vacancies here. And rather than saying we consistently met staff ratios, I would say they met staff ratios by resorting to inordinate amounts of overtime and mandated shifts and use counting in people that were intended to be supplements and not substitutes for frontline staff. So I'm not trying to protect them.
And I wasn't saying, I just.
I agree with you. This is not a satisfactory situation. The reason that I try not to be too I spend a lot of time over here, and I understand there's some awfully good people who are working awfully hard to do some really great things with people who are really sick, and they're doing it. And so I can get awfully frustrated and say, this is the damnedest system I've ever seen, and it should all be condemned. And then I go over there and I say, they've been working hard, and somebody actually makes me something, and I think, geez, I gotta be a little bit, I gotta be a little bit measured here, because there is some good work being done. It's not all bad, there's some really good work, but we just can't seem to clean up the edges to make it work the way we want it. As in Elizabeth's report, for example, the Moab training, just as one little piece of information, Moab training, it sounded like, well, some of people got trained pretty well, some people didn't get trained hardly at all, at least it didn't stick, but yet she observed 2 incidents directly while she was there, and said they did it very well. It was handled extremely well. These were 2 incidents of really aggressive behavior, and it was handled well. So it isn't all black and white, so I have to sort of measure it. And I know, for example, you can't be too critical of them, about psychiatrists, and so on and so forth, because it don't care who you are. If you're in the state system and have to go through the procedures for employment, which you have to go through, you can't hire a psychiatrist like that. It's a dance to get the staff we need. But we have to really focus on what we can do, and it seems to me that unit-based staffing is something we can do and should do, and it will solve a lot of the problems. Probably enhance their recruitment efforts, because if you come to work there, or if you're contemplating going to work there, and they say, well, you could be working on any of the 4 units, and you know that, well, I've heard a lot about lower stock levels, that are going to be working there, you might, and you may be put in there on a float, and you've never been there before. None of us would like that job. If we had another shop, we'd go someplace else. Okay. So I think that is something that those kinds of things, if we can get some accountability built into it and say, okay, that's going to be done. When? Do it. I think we can make some progress. That's what I'm hoping. We shall see. But there is some good work. Beth slid over a question here that she had asked previously to somebody. What level of risk do you feel currently exists for serious staff or patient injury due to the staffing situation? That's a legitimate question. I think it's dangerous to say this, because there are some clients over there who are capable at a moment's notice of inflicting great injury on people. So it's pretty dangerous. It's not wise to say, oh, it couldn't happen. It could happen. But my own assessment is, I think that it's probably the level of risk right now is less than it was certainly a year ago. The level of risk is probably better, safer at this point than it was a year and a half, 2 years ago. I think they made some improvements and staff and trained enough to and the other thing is that it ebbs and flows. You can look at the seclusion and restraint and psychiatric emergency statistics, which I get every week. And they will go up very high. Often it's one or two people, it's the same person. There may be a guy in Lower Saco who assaults, there is a guy who assaults 4 or 5 times a week. One guy. And so if something happens, he improves or goes away or something, usually improves, all of a sudden everything looks good. But then somebody else comes in and, you know, and the numbers go up again. And they're small numbers. I mean, there's only 92 people over there when it's totally full. So if you got one person who is assaulting 6 times a week, that knocks those, you know, those numbers off pretty drastically. You always have to sort of look at that and say, okay, who is it, you know? But we are making progress, and I think we will make it someday. That's my hope.
I think, you know, before the Senator Gross, what can we do to help to fix the problem of staff vacancies? You know, it might be because potential workers have safety concerns. It might be because they don't like mandated overtime. It might be because the pay is too low. It might be because there's lack of union staffing, as you say. And it's just, I think we as a committee at some point have to decide how are we going to get these answers, because we're not getting them here. We all have the same interest. This is hard. This is really not a partisan issue. And it's just, it's frustrating not to be able to, it's people who represent our constituents to be able to do much about it. Personal renting.
Mr. Chair, I want to follow on the line of Lincoln. This has nothing to do with the judge, because he's with the master over there, through a different administration, through different hard times. This is to us, because my frustration level is hitting the peak. That I've been here a long time. The forensic side, criminal justice has always taken an active role in. We have tried to deal with this time and time again. But to have people that have to come in front of the legislature to be confirmed, to show that partnership that we have with them, to not come into a committee that's trying to get an understanding of what they're doing, to me is appalling. And if we could subpoena people to come in on the last issue that we talked about, I can't understand why we don't subpoena these people to come in and talk to us, and I'm going to make that as a motion at some point today, because I think we've gone on long enough with this issue not being resolved, certainly not being understood very well, and needing to do something about it. We have people working and clients across the river. The reason they're across the river so that we never forget they were there. And we're not able to get to the bottom of some of these things because the people that are in charge are not coming in here, whether they're allowed or not allowed, but they're not coming in here. And I think that it's appalling for us to put up with that, any more than we would have put up with it in the last issue that we discussed with Goodwill Hinckley. We subpoenaed people to come in because they wouldn't do it voluntarily. We've asked and begged and pleaded for these people to come in and talk to us, and they haven't. And I think it's about time this committee does something to force them in here. Now, that's my frustration level. I think that's universal in this committee. I know it's universal with the people that have served on criminal justice with me over the years and the people that have been involved in this issue. I certainly know that it's frustration level that the good chair has expressed to me over time. So thank you very much. Let me say something that has nothing to do with the judge here, because he's doing his job, but I got to do mine. And I got constituents in this office that want to see something done.
I'm not going to respond to that. I just wanted to add one thing. I was trying to end on an optimistic note. And there is cause for optimism, because typically we would be looking at this and saying, well, it's really a question, we need more money. The legislature in the last session, in the budget, included roughly $6 million of additional funding for Riverview per year, primarily for staff. And so it's there, as I said last year when I was appearing with the commissioner before appropriations committee, somebody said, I don't know whether you were there or not, but somebody said, what do we need to do? And I held up the budget and I said, it's there. You've done what you can do. And so they do, in fact, this is not a money situation at this point. This is a management and an execution situation. And so it really is a question of, can they execute? And that was my question was, have you executed? My conclusion is, not 100% satisfactorily you haven't. So what can we do to beef that up while we've got the money to do it? So that's where we're at.
Thank you. Representative Sanderson?
Thank you, and thank you, sir, for being here. Normally, we meet down at the other end of the building.
Yes, that's right. You actually heard most of us before one
I
time.
have a time or two, yes. Yes, absolutely. I wanted to thank you for being here. The acuity specialists, it's my understanding throughout the process that though they, when you were discussing replacing versus supplementing, that the acuity specialists were going to have a higher degree of training, and therefore maybe they did not need to have them as well as all of the mental health workers, because it's my understanding all of the mental health workers were not being replaced, just a portion. But the higher level of training in the acuity level specialists would give them the opportunity to recognize a situation and perhaps diffuse a situation prior to having it escalate into an event. And that was the value of the acuity specialists. Is that correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
and they do that.
Yeah.
And that's a commendable addition, but not necessarily a substitution. That's the,
Certainly not the substitution for all, but and then you receive quarterly reports on what goes, everything that happens over there. Is that correct?
that's correct.
And you have been for years?
Yeah.
And when you were speaking earlier about all the tasering, I got the feeling that it happened a lot over there, but that didn't happen a lot.
There were 47 incidents in a one-year period where either taser, pepper spray was either used, displayed, or threatened,
Okay.
and nobody knew it. It did not appear.
Those weren't appearing in your report?
No.
Were they supposed to for the consent decree?
Well,
Or
there
no?
were- There was, yes, and they also should have appeared, they should have been reported to licensing, and they should have been reported to Adult Protective Services.
And they weren't documented in the medical record? None of them?
I'm not sure about, I don't believe so, but I'm not sure about that. But they, to their credit, when the new superintendent was at that time an acting superintendent, when he came in, they went back, and it must have been reported in the medical record, because they reconstructed on their own the 47 instances. So, and they were forthright in saying, okay, these should have been reported, they weren't reported, it shouldn't have happened, and it happened 47 times. Now, they didn't use those things 47 times, but they were either threatened to use, which is the same sort of thing. You come in,
But at the
and
very
you guys
least,
know, if you come in and upholster your taser, that inhibits activities. That you guys didn't have tasers.
but at the very least, it was documented by the medical staff, so it was certainly something that wasn't trying to be,
Well-
I mean, if they could recreate those 47 times, it had to be. So there wasn't this
Well, it was
effort.
documented by, I don't want to say that I know exactly how they documented all of it, but I know, for example, one of them, the medical records would not have indicated if there was anything wrong. The only thing that showed it up was the films. It didn't match the medical records. And they had films that showed, no, this didn't happen the way that it's reflected on the medical records. So there was the reporting was not handled correctly at any level. And they acknowledged that. They acknowledged it, and that was whether it was the fault of the superintendent or not, she was dismissed, and that was the end of it.
Yeah. Just one more. I mean, how do you feel, of course, we know the real fly in the ointment is a lot of the higher level of forensic patients that are being brought into the hospital that was clearly designed for civil patients to begin with. I mean, how do you see that in the future? I'm trying to get a...
Well, I'm not sure that I would agree that the real problem is the aggressive, behaviorally challenged forensic patients, necessarily. You can have the exact same situation on the civil side, and they do. I mean, often people on the civil side present as much risk and produce as many assaults and so on and so forth as there is on the forensic side. So it's not, at times, it's more on the forensic side and it's more in lower Saco because that's the entry unit, everybody that comes in on the forensic side. But it is not just saying, okay, look, let's all go to civil and we won't have those problems.
Yeah, no, that's not what I was saying, but certainly on the forensic side, until these clients who need to utilize the hospital reach a level of stabilization, do we see a higher escalation of events?
Yeah, I think if you probably looked at the incidents, there would be more of them occurring on lower Saco than there is on lower Kennebec, but not totally. Some of the more, I would say that there's probably one of the people who would be considered under certain circumstances to be probably the most dangerous person over there is on the civil side.
Thank you.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and certainly I hope that we're close to wrapping this up, but
Help.
I'm trying to bring you back to, I will be short and help that. But, I have to go back for a moment to your comment about our having done what we can in the budget, and this is a problem of management. And that, for me, underscores the significance of our not having management here to discuss with us what's being done about that, and we have to change that.
Other questions for Justice Wathen? Thank you so much for being here. This is really, really helpful to us.
Anytime. I will show up.
Thank you. Thank you. Other parts of this issue you want to raise? Okay. Gentlemen, we're going to conclude this with Senator Guzowski.
Yes, because I really rather not include anything until I have at least the opportunity to make a motion to subpoena people, to bring the commissioner and to bring the director of the hospital in front of this committee, because I certainly can't do it in criminal justice. Don't have the authority. But this committee does have the authority to subpoena.
We've done that, obviously, but it's always been in the context, I think, of the ongoing review. I guess this is not review. What do you professionally
It is an ongoing review. It's at a partway point on one of the questions that we're attempting to answer for you. So you're really in sort of a monitoring mode on a issue we've raised before we got to the end of our process. I guess I would need to maybe review with Linda Pisner the authorities in our statute. I don't think there's anything there that limits when you can use the subpoena power. So I'm going to say, I guess is appropriate anytime you deem it necessary. But I don't know for sure. We haven't used it in this context before.
Representative Sampson?
Thank you. Director, was there a refusal on the part of the commissioner to be here, or was it, there was a prior commitment?
It said her schedule would not allow her to come today. So
Okay.
we could try again.
I would suggest maybe we try again before we go to the point of subpoena.
Senator Johnson, excuse me, I'm sorry, Senator Burns.
Well, not a sequence here, but I think I want the same information that everybody else in Horseshoe wants. Before we go to the extent of subpoenas, I would really like to know, first of all, feedback from the speaker, and also whether or not there is any other way to have the presence of people we need to hear from. And if that's possible at our next meeting, then I hope we use that course first, rather than go to the extent of subpoenaing the staff in here.
Senator Johnson and Senator Diamond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. But we already have a refusal to have Jay come before us. We have a process which is interfering with our, ask people to come before us and appear here and review from the governor's office. I think that we do have an obstacle to getting people before us. The commission may be able to come and willing to come if we were to ask again, but we already have one refusal to appear.
I don't know how to explain this. There are some technicalities in the way one is supposed to ask a request of the governor's office. One of them is to be outline what it is that you want the person to be discussing with the committee. In the chair's letter requesting that Mr. Harper be here, we asked for Mr. Harper the scope of what he was here to discuss, because these questions were initially posed to him, not the commissioner. But she had responded to you in October, and so the scope that was laid out in that letter was for him to respond to the commissioner's responses. So technically, we didn't get a refusal for him to be here. What they said was, he's not the appropriate person to be responding to the commissioner's stuff that she sent you sheets. So if we try again with a different, laying that out differently in terms of why we want him to be here and her to be here, we might get a different response. So to some degree, it's sort of carving it out in the way that gets gets what we want.
Senator Diamond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I work really hard not to get outraged or get offended. All these things seem to be the common thing to do in these days. But also, never, and frankly, I'm getting sick of this. The fact that we are unable to get key people to come before this committee because they're not allowed to, and it's almost become routine. I find that, Senator Kozowski said, used the word abhorrent. It's even more than that. And I think every one of us should be outraged and offended at that. I mean, we're not asking for just some trivial person to stop by. We're talking about two key people in a situation that we know and maybe life or death, certainly injurious to people working for the state. How can we even think about not making those people come? We should be so offended by that. I mean, this is bad news for some, I'm sure, but I've worked under 6 governors. This has never, ever happened. Independents, Republicans, Democrats. And I think we can't let it go on. We have to put our foot down, and we have to say, well, this is not frivolous. We're not asking for some frivolous person to stop in. We'll decide who we want to talk to, not somebody else. And I think we ought to say as a committee, we want X and Y to come before our committee. We'll give you time to get your schedule right, and I just soon do that. We'll try again, give them another month to get their schedule in line, whatever it takes. I'm willing to do that. But don't come back and tell this committee, we're not going to allow you to talk to these people. It is so outrageous, I'm having difficulty even articulating. So, Mr. Chair, I hope this committee will say enough is enough. Other committees can't do that. We can. It's time for us to say, we know who we need to talk to. It's a very serious issue, and we'd like to have you be here. Please, if not, we're going to make you come. and we will adjust to your schedule. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Starkey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just think it's really interesting that we're sitting here talking about someone who's paid quite a lot amount of money to do their job, which is part of is giving us information. And we just finished a huge discussion about mandated overtime for workers who are making a whole lot less. And I don't know that requesting the Commissioner Mayhew to come nicely without a subpoena is going to do it, because she, as far as I know, the commissioner didn't appear at least twice before Health and Human Services very recently, and they just concluded some out-of-session committee that couldn't even come up with a report because they couldn't get the information they needed. And I guess my question, as a second-term legislator, is I never thought that you had to outline every single thing that you wanted to ask somebody or tell them what the context or everything that you wanted to talk about when they came in to talk to you, because that doesn't happen in every committee. It seems to only happen in certain committees. And is that a process that's happened for a long time, or is that relatively new? So maybe you could inform me. I would really appreciate that.
It is what is expressed. There's a letter from the governor to the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate that outlines what the protocol will be for requesting agency participation in a committee. So I may have made it sound a little more stringent than it is, but part of that request is you're supposed to say what it is that you want them there for and what the time of the meeting is and all of that.
Yes, Representative.
So here's my question though, is that new, or is that the way it's always been?
I can't remember the date of the letter. October is the date the letter went out. I think the practice, though, was in place, has been in place several interims now that there's been sort of.
All right, but that's with this administration, not previous. I don't ever remember hearing this in previous administrations, that I thought the commissioners, they worked for the people of Maine. I mean, and that they were supposed to help us do our job.
I've only been here through one other administration, and the committee did not deal with this at then.
And Representative DeShane.
Thank you. Just food for thought. Would it be appropriate for us to make our own protocol under what circumstances we're going to subpoena somebody and then send a letter? I'm half joking, half serious. I mean, we have our own procedures. We have the means for enforcing those procedures, and maybe it would be a good line of communication to state what those will be going forward. When we have expectations of when somebody's going to appear before the Government Oversight Committee, because we can't oversee anything if government won't show up.
Representative Sanderson.
Thank you. I guess I'm a little confused here. While I totally agree with Senator Diamond regarding the importance of having departmental input on a lot of these issues that come before us, I did not hear Director Ashcroft say there was a refusal to come. It sounds to me like it's a conflict, and the commissioner just couldn't make it. I did not hear the director say the executive refused them to allow them to come here today. Now, if they had, I would understand this conversation that we're having. But we've set our meeting time and we've sent out a letter. We don't know what is on the commissioner's calendar and how far out that goes. I would certainly understand an outrage if we sent another invitation and they couldn't again come in another month. But for this one, I would hope that we could be reasonable and give the commissioner the benefit of the doubt that, yes, there was indeed a prior commitment.
And I'm happy to do that, but let me suggest a middle ground perhaps, because the calendar continues to go by. We only meet maybe once a month. You may be right, Representative Sanderson, but you also might be wrong. And I don't want to wait till after Red Sox opening day to be able to deal with this. So one possible solution is to say we will send an invitation, and that we'll ask for a response within X days. If we don't get a favorable response, then the subpoena will issue. I think that takes into account what you're talking about, but won't delay the incredibly important work that we're in charge of doing. Senator Diamond and then Senator Davis.
And that sounds good to me, except that I thought I heard the director say that Mr. Harper, somebody else determined whether or not he was the right person. I don't want to let anybody decide who they think. We'll decide who we think. And then give them plenty of time, adjust their schedule. So I agree, let's send a letter out, and I would fully expect them both to be here next time.
No. Representative Sprocket, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to follow up with when we'll hear back from Judge Wathen. I guess the follow, what will happen if he does his investigation. Will we hear back on that, or?
I think the judge has always been willing to come when you wanted to hear from him. What I understood was that he was going to be doing his extra investigation over the next month. So I would say at least a month's time from now before he would have anything further to share with you. But I think he would certainly come back. It's been our experience with him so far.
Thank you. Senator Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Don't we meet every other week when we're in session? So you could offer 2 dates.
The second and fourth Fridays of the month.
So we could offer 2 dates. Seems like one of them would work.
I hope they're the same date. Senator Guzowski.
Thanks once again, Mr. Chair. And I'm willing to amend my motion.
You don't have a motion yet.
Okay. And I don't have to amend anything, but I would like to get out of my mouth that we passed a bill in the legislature last year that if the legislator doesn't show up to work when he's supposed to, he can have his pay deducted. Well, these people are working for us and they're getting paid by us. And if we're asking them to come in and they choose to be going someplace else that day, we're the priority, not wherever else they're going is not the priority. We are the priority. We pay them paychecks. So I think that it's about time we start acting like the employer instead of the employee and being told what they'll tell us and what we can ask. I want to be able to ask any question I want to ask because one question always leads to another. And I would like to can't make a motion, but I'd like to go along with what the good Senator Davis just said and Senator Diamond, that we can invite him again, and we can do it in a different way. But if we get the same results, as Einstein once said, if you're going to keep doing the same thing time after time, getting the same results, you might want to start changing the way you're doing it.
Did Einstein say that?
I don't think that was Solomon. So, well, there is no motion on the floor. Well, if someone wants to make a motion, they don't, I'll make one. Senator Johnson.
Okay, I kind of thought you had made a motion to invite them again, and if they refuse, that we issue a subpoena and authorize the chairs to do that.
So, Senator Johnson, is your motion that we would invite Jay Harper and Commissioner Mayhew to choose between one of our next 2 meetings, ask them to respond to that request within 10 days, and if we don't get a favorable response, then a subpoena will be issued?
That sounds like an excellent clarification.
Second of the motion?
I'll second that.
Discussion? Yeah. Senator Burns.
My question would be, will we include the scope of what it is we want to discuss with them, so that they won't have to come here prepared to talk about negative things? I think that's appropriate. I don't want to get into this back and forth thing. That's a separate branch of government. Let's do what we have to do here in order to meet our requirements. We're not going to do what they have to do to meet their requirements. So I think that's appropriate for us to try to follow that criteria that they set forth for us.
Thank you. Further discussion about the motion, Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I certainly agree we want to give them the scope of what we are looking to discuss with them, but I am also adamant that we should not be simply posing a specific set of questions to expect to be answered. Our scope would be regarding the performance as, reported on by the court master and response from the department in order to get questions answered.
That was the intent of the motion. Senator, I thank you. Representative Sanders.
Thank you. Just to clarify, was the motion that we will send a letter if we do not hear back from them within 10 days, then a subpoena will be issued? Was that the motion?
Well, almost, the motion was that they would be invited to come to one of the next two meetings of their choosing,
Mhm.
and ask them to give us a response within 10 days. And if the response was not yes, then a subpoena would issue. I believe, is that the motion?
Yes.
But the subpoena power that this committee has, I think, is an extreme privilege for us to be able to use. This talk of subpoena has come up because the commissioner couldn't be here today because of a scheduling conflict. I think that may be a little premature. I'm a little unsure about that.
Well, Representative, the only thing I'd say is that this issue is not in a vacuum. Every committee which has met since the end of the session, as I understand it, has had the same problem. I can tell you we've had it on appropriations. I can tell you we've had it on the special commission I was on to study difficult to place patients. And as recently as last week, the commissioner's public relations person indicated that this same policy about administration officials appearing before legislative committees was going to continue into the next session. So I'm certainly willing to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, but this doesn't sound like entirely a scheduling issue. So again, the reason I will vote in favor of the motion is that this is not a back burner problem. There are constituents of mine who work there, who are in physical danger. Maybe it's less than it was a year ago, but it's still there. And we can't be sitting on our hands. It's irresponsible. Further discussion of the motion? Everybody understand the motion? All in favor, please so indicate. Opposed? 11-1, Representative Sanderson, the minority. Anything further with respect to this agenda item? Seeing none,